So Joseph, as we learned last week, he's in prison, right? He had interpreted the dreams of the chief butler and the chief baker, which both had one dream the same night. And Joseph interprets their dreams, explains to them what they meant, and lo and behold, they come to pass, where the baker was put to death for his crime, and the chief butler was restored back to his position serving the Pharaoh. Joseph, knowing the butler would be restored in his position, asked him in chapter 40, verses 14 through 15, he says, "But remember me when it is all well with you, and please show kindness to me. Make mention of me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and also I have done nothing here that they should put me into the dungeon." And so, when the butler was restored, he resumed his duties to the Pharaoh, and life was good. However, the last verse tells us in chapter 40, it says, "Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him." He completely forgot Joseph, and we will see for how long as we pick things up in Genesis chapter 41. Verse 1, "Then it came to pass at the end of 2 full years." Wait, stop. 2 full years had passed. He had forgotten Joseph, and he remained for 2 more years. And despite the butler's amnesia, Joseph remained faithful to God. It goes to show us a shut door can only be opened by the Lord and not us. Remember, Joseph reached out to the butler and said, "Hey, remember me, tell him this good things," because he wanted out of there. But a shut door can only be opened by the Lord and not us. And it'll be in his perfect timing when this door will be opened, right? That he is in the right place at the right time, as we will see. But 2 years had gone by, and it came to pass that Pharaoh, back in verse 1, had a dream, and behold, he stood by the river, speaking of the Nile River. Suddenly there came up out of the river 7 cows, fine looking and fat. Boy, I wish that was a description that I can go by. And they fed in the meadow. So Pharaoh sees these good, healthy cows coming out of the river. And cows, they would cool themselves in the river from the heat of the day and taking a break from all the sun and the flies and all that. But they would come out of the river. They were looking fine and fat, just as a good ribeye should. And they go and feed in the meadow. Verse 3, "Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them out of the river, ugly and gaunt." So he sees there's these other 7 cows that are coming out of the river. And they were ugly and gaunt, meaning they were excessively thin. They looked unhealthy. And they stood by the other cows on the bank of the river. Now, here's where the dream gets a little odd, in his dream. Because, dreams do sometimes get odd. It says, verse 4, "And the ugly and gaunt cows," the skinny ones, "ate up the 7 fine-looking and fat cows. So Pharaoh awoke." So this was so weird that it woke him up. Now, I know we're just reading this in the Bible, and we're like, well, that doesn't sound too scary to wake him up. But this was enough of a dream that it woke him up. I don't know about you. Have you ever been woken up from a dream where you're just like, what was that, That's exactly what Pharaoh does. So it wasn't fun, but he lays back down, probably like we all do, going, "Oh, thank goodness that was just a dream." And then he laid back down, and verse 5, "And he slept and dreamed a second time. And suddenly 7 heads of grain came up on one stalk, plump and good." So these were healthy stalks with nice 7 grains coming out of it. "Then behold, 7 thin heads, blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them. And the 7 thin heads devoured the 7 plump and full heads." So we have these carnivorous wheat here that are eating the other 7 heads of wheat. That's crazy. So Pharaoh, he woke up. Again, indeed, it was a dream. "Now it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled." So he has these 2 dreams. He couldn't shake them. He couldn't. This was just now bothering him. He has 2 that are very similar, and he's probably trying to figure out, well, what did I eat yesterday for dinner that would probably, it wasn't the fish was good. No. So he realizes that, these dreams, they mean something. They were significant. He believes these dreams are telling him something as if he was being warned. So he's troubled in spirit. And so what does he do? He sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them for the Pharaoh. So these are the folks who the Pharaoh would go to, and they were like kind of advisors, where he would kind of seek if they would understand, hey, give me wisdom in this. What is this all about? And there were these magicians who were all experts in their cult, and they couldn't interpret the dreams. And so he called the wise men, and they also could not interpret his dreams. They couldn't, so they didn't. And I give them kudos for that, not to attempt to say, oh, this is what it's about, and be completely false. No, these guys were like, I'm not touching that one. This is the Pharaoh. I can't interpret it. And there's a good reason why they couldn't interpret the dreams. It's because it does not come from darkness or the occult. Joseph tells us in chapter 40, verse 8, he says, do not interpretations belong to God? This is why they couldn't interpret them. If it was like from a demonic or a dark kind of realm, I'm sure that the dreams would speak to them, but this came from God, right? So they couldn't interpret them because God had already ordained one man, according to his perfect timing, the ability to interpret Pharaoh's dreams for his sovereign plan for all mankind. So, verse 9, then the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my faults this day. Oh, well, good for him. 2 years later, he remembers now, right? How he forgot all this time about Joseph. And he's like, oh, man, there's this guy, I feel guilty, It's like, this is my bad. I'm sure Joseph would have been like, yeah, you're bad. But he remembers Joseph, and now at this time would mention him and says, I remember when Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. Both me and the chief baker, we each had a dream in one night, he and I. Each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now, there was a young Hebrew man with us there, a servant of the captain of the guard. And we told him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each man, he interpreted according to his own dream. And it came to pass, just as he interpreted for us, so it happened. He restored me to office, and he hanged him. So he's telling Pharaoh, look, we have this guy in our prison who interprets these kinds of dreams. Both mine, and the baker's dreams, they came to pass. Well, I'm sure that's not what the baker was dreaming for, But he basically is saying that, look, his interpretations, they proved accurate. And he's batting 2 for 2. So after 2 years, where Joseph had been forgotten, he's now remembered in God's perfect timing. Why? Because the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, right? He had this kind of a dream. So then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him quickly out of the dungeon. I'm sure he never imagined that this day would be anything different than the last 730 days, 2 years, right? Since the butler forgot about him. But then all of a sudden, here comes this group of people who called for Joseph and brought him out quickly. So everything all came to this moment. All of God's preparation in Joseph's life would now be put to use. The thing is, we tend to focus a lot on the time when God is focusing on our development. We spend more time thinking about what we or I could be doing while God is working on our character, on how he will use us. While we are waiting, just know that God is working. And during this time, realize that he is transforming us into the image of his Son and how we will be used by him. So be still and let God in those times. Don't be in a rush. Just realize that he's developing you. He's transforming you in your character to be more like Jesus. And that's a great thing. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Because when his timing happens, you'll be ready, right? In all aspects, from humility to love to wisdom to servanthood, patience with others, long-suffering, kindness, and I can keep going on. And these sound like the fruit of the Spirit, doesn't it? Okay, which the fruit of the Spirit is Christ Jesus. But you understand, right? Joseph was in the prison, not knowing he was prepared. He was ready, right? For the hand of God to move and to place him before Pharaoh. It's pretty amazing, I think, right? Being a follower of Jesus Christ, you just don't know when or how, God is going to move in your life. But when he does, it's absolutely incredible. It puts you in awe. You're like, that is the hand of the Lord. So I'm just saying, putting that out. So they go to him. They brought him quickly out of the dungeon, and he shaved, changed his clothes, and came to Pharaoh. Joseph went from looking and smelling like a prisoner to being all cleaned up and presentable to Pharaoh. Notice it says that he shaved. In the Egyptian culture, they would shave their whole bodies, right? They would shave everything from head to toe. And being that Joseph was in Potiphar's home, watching over his household and everything, and it's very possible that Joseph had already been shaven and kind of brought into that Egyptian culture. But you got to understand, though, he hadn't been shaven for almost 2 years. So he probably looked like he just came fresh out of the 70s, or looked like John the Baptist with this beard, and I don't know. But anyways, they shaved him, they cleaned him up, and put him in clean garments, and now he's presentable to go to the Pharaoh. Verse 15, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it, but I have heard it said of you that you can understand a dream to interpret it. Notice Pharaoh points the finger at Joseph. I heard of you, and that you can interpret dreams. You. But look how 13 years of preparation answers this question. So Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Joseph pointed to God. Joseph's like, whoa, wait a minute, Pharaoh. You're saying you, but it is not in me. I will tell you who will give you an answer of peace. It's God. This is now Joseph's character. All this preparation, and we see him give God all the glory. It would be easy to think, yeah, I did interpret those dreams, But rather, he says, no, it's not in me. And I think that's amazing that we see this. He said, God will give you the interpretations. How does Joseph know this to be true? How is he fully sure that he stands before the Pharaoh and that he will give him the interpretation of the dream? Well, I can safely say, these are just kind of thoughts I'm throwing out there. He does believe in dreams, right? And that God will interpret him because obviously God used him to interpret the butler and the baker's dreams. And second, Joseph believed the Lord will show favor for him in this situation, in this matter. And don't forget, Joseph had 2 dreams as well. All right? So Joseph's faith, it was completely in God. Just a couple of thoughts. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, behold, this is where he starts to explain it to him. In my dream, I stood on the bank of the river. Suddenly 7 cows came up out of the river, fine looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and gaunt, such ugliness as I have never seen in the land of Egypt. And the gaunt and ugly cows ate up the first 7, the fat cows. When they had eaten them up, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were just as ugly as the beginning. So I awoke. So as we can see, we see a lot more insight of the dream here. So these cows were nothing like he's ever seen before. Verse 22, also I saw in my dream, and suddenly 7 heads came up on one stalk, full and good. Then behold, 7 heads withered, thin, blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them. and the thin heads devoured the 7 good heads. So I told this to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. So the Pharaoh at this point is like, here are my dreams. The magician and the wise men, they couldn't interpret it. The stage is yours. What do these dreams mean? He wants to get right to the bottom of this. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. In other words, you have 2 different dreams, but they are of the same meaning. They're of the same interpretation, and here's what they mean. Verse 26. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads are 7 years. The dreams are one. So these both carry the same meaning. It's not your food cravings there, Pharaoh. We're not talking about 7 steak tacos and 7 tortilla chips. They represent years. I'm sorry, I love Mexican food. As a matter of fact, I ate some today, so still love it. Yes, Cinco de Mayo. And the 7 thin and ugly cows which came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty heads blighted by the east wind are 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. Verse 29. Indeed, 7 years of great plenty will come throughout all the land of Egypt. So we got 7 years of great plenty. Egypt will be gaining as much produce and everything than they've ever had before. I mean, we're talking this is a huge, huge plenty that he's speaking of. Verse 30, but after them 7 years of famine will arise, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will deplete the land. So the plenty will not be known in the land because of the famine following, for it will be very severe, to the point where Egypt would be depleted. Now that says a lot, being that everything, that was like the place that you go to in a famine. Remember when Abraham, when they were going in the famine in the land, that's where he was headed towards, was Egypt? Remember that? When he tried to say his wife was his sister and that failed. But Egypt was the place to go to. And here, this is a place where, you would go to, and it's going to be depleted. So it's very serious, and to the point where you won't even remember the plenty. That's pretty serious. Verse 32. And the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. This is interesting. So God told Pharaoh once, and to establish his truth, God reiterated it by giving Pharaoh the second dream, that it's coming soon. Notice how this dream is shown twice, so God may establish his truth. Now, throughout the Bible, the number 2 typically deals with the witnesses. 2 witnesses are required to establish a fact. Joseph would know that God had established this in the repetition of the dreams. Joseph himself, remember, he had 2 dreams that spoke of the same thing. But even though this hadn't been established yet in the scriptures, as it will be in the law of Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 19:15, Joseph understood and he knew the principle. This was a repeat. God is establishing his truth. He also understood the sense of urgency in the matter, where he said it'll come to pass shortly. So God gave Pharaoh 2 witnesses through these 2 dreams, establishing, as it says in verse 32, established by God, that this is going to happen, and it's going to happen shortly. The 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine is coming. So Joseph now is going to give Pharaoh something he doesn't ask for. It's an answer to the next common sense question that Pharaoh may have asked in his mind, or what we would ask. What was it? What do we do? Yeah, what do I do? Right? So after this answer comes to Joseph by a word of knowledge, because this is given by God, right? And a word of wisdom. God is giving all this to Joseph in this moment. Verse 33. Now, therefore, okay, after he just explained these dreams, that this is what's coming, he says, now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. And I just want to point out, he's not referring or speaking to himself or of himself. All right, he's just given him wisdom. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years. So he's taxing the people about 20% of the produce of the land of Egypt. Now, would be considered a high tax in their time, right? This was no chump change. But the people will fall in line with Pharaoh's decree. Why? They're not going to fight him. He's the Pharaoh. He's in power. But the thing is, and here's what we got to keep in mind, is God promised 7 years of plenty. I mean, plenty. It's an abundance. There will be even more than they need, right, to supplement any loss from the taxes. That's how plentiful God is going to do this, especially for 7 years. So this is not going to hurt them like they think. As a matter of fact, they're going to have more than enough to be just like, take it, take it. Take as much as we need. Verse 35, and let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. So this food would be stored, right? It'll be controlled by the authority of Pharaoh. And this is why, verse 36. Then that the food shall be as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during the famine. So God gives Joseph the knowledge that Pharaoh needed. He needed that. He needed the answer to, what shall I do? And the wisdom he gave him of how much he needed to tax the people to get through the famine. Pharaoh had no answers yet, let alone knowing how much to tax, whether, do I do 40, do I do 20? He didn't know what was enough. And God used Joseph to speak the truth. He says, you need 20%. He gave him complete wisdom on how to survive this famine. Joseph didn't have all this time. He didn't know he was going to be there that day. He was in the prison probably braiding his hair. I don't know. But then they go and they grab him, and he's now presented. So all this dream, God, his hand was in it. He gave Joseph everything he needed to stand before the Pharaoh and give him all the wisdom in that moment. And I think it's amazing, because it would be totally impossible for him to sit there and go, well, let me think real quick, unless he's just got some special gift of math, Well, there's this many people in Egypt. No, he didn't know that. But this came from God. Verse 37, so the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. So you got to understand, too, all these servants, they're going to be like, looking at this guy like, here's this Hebrew, He just gave the Pharaoh all this great advice. None of them feel threatened. That's an important thought to think about. Is this guy going to, take my position? Oh, what's going to happen now? Is this guy now going to be in charge of me? They didn't look at him as a scoundrel or nothing. They just looked at him, and they all had, favor with him. Verse 38, and Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God? So here Pharaoh sees that Joseph not only interpreted his dreams, but brought forth great wisdom to resolve the matter, all in one, saying that he is capable of such a task, whom is the Spirit of God. It's amazing. Pharaoh sees God working through Joseph. Right? Pretty cool. So verse 39. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. So now, at this very moment, Joseph just became the second most powerful man in the world, just under Pharaoh. And to think his day started off in prison. Wow. Verse 41, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then the Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand. Now the signet ring was a ring with Pharaoh's seal on it. All right, it was used to sign documents. He would press the ring on this clay, right, and it would leave his imprint, and it would dry up just like that one. There you go, and it would leave his impression on the hardened clay, right? And in this ring, it carried all the authority, and he gave it to Joseph to wear. And he clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck because he was hooking Joseph up with some bling. No, he was just... The gold chain around his neck would be recognition that he was second in command to the Pharaoh. So when people saw that around his neck, they realized, okay, this guy's second in command. And he had him ride in the second chariot which he had. So Pharaoh would be in the first chariot that he rode, and then obviously Joseph would be in the second. So all the people, he not only did this proclamation, this declaration within the servants and all that and by his throne, but he went out with Joseph on the chariots to declare it to the people. All right? Pharaoh is publicly declaring that Joseph is the second in command, that he has all this authority and that he has given it to Joseph. And they cried out before him, "Bow the knee." So he set him over all the land of Egypt. So this was a public thing, right, in front of the people. And then in public, Pharaoh also said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no man may lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." Think about that. That is power. They can't put their hand or foot in Egypt without his consent. Verse 45, and Pharaoh called Joseph's name Saphnath-Paneah, and he gave him as a wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. So Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. Right? He has been given a new name. This was an Egyptian name. And this Saphnath-Paneah means the God who speaks and lives. Okay, lower G. But we will see that God will keep his name Joseph throughout the scripture. So that doesn't change. And he's given an Egyptian wife, a pagan wife, a daughter of a priest, of a pagan worship. And where the city of On, it's pretty interesting, was the city of sun worship. They worshiped the sun. So I assumed that they had tan skin and, maybe sunspots and, hopefully nothing that needed to be removed. But this is Pharaoh's way of honoring Joseph. He likes Joseph. In verse 46, it says, and Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from his presence of Pharaoh, or from the presence of Pharaoh, and went throughout all the land of Egypt. So this, although seemed like an overnight success, was 13 years in the making when he stood before the Pharaoh. And in those 13 years, God had developed his character to be able to be ready and to represent God before the Pharaoh. Nobody can just walk up into that position, right? The most powerful man in the world at that time. 13 years it took for him to be developed to be the second most powerful man in the world at that time. And what a man Joseph was, okay? And look what Joseph does right away. He gets right to work. He goes out of the presence of the Pharaoh, and he went throughout all the land of Egypt and gets to business. He begins to oversee everything that will be put in place. Verse 47, now, in the 7 plentiful years, the ground brought forth abundantly, just as the Lord said. Verse 48, so he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt and laid up the food in the cities. He laid up in every city the food of the fields which surrounded them. Joseph gathered very much grain as the sand of the sea until he stopped counting, for it was immeasurable. So you can imagine, right? He puts all these storehouses and all these systems in place, and they begin to measure everything and count it and start keeping record. But they got to the point where there was just so much grain that the math was failing them. They couldn't keep track of how much more they were having. So I think that's great. But let's think about Joseph's preparation here. I know I like to hit on it a little bit, but let's think about it. Let's kind of dissect it a little bit. He was at the age of 30 when he stood before Pharaoh. He was taken to Egypt at the age of 17 as a servant. And I don't believe you're ready at the age of 17 to have that kind of power, right? But think about who he was when he showed up to Egypt. He was the son, of a family of a bunch of brothers, right, who were all shepherds. They were just shepherds. He was a very innocent kid. He was very naive, but just very under his dad's, right in his arm, right there in his right hand most of the time, and telling him, hey, go check on him and all that. But they were specialists in sheep, and herds and flocks, and that's what was passed down, right? And within his 7 years in serving as a slave, as a servant, under Potiphar, he learned enough skills, to include the culture, to include the language and the customs, that Potiphar recognized him for his hard work, his integrity, his character, his loyalty, and he gave him full authority over his whole house. Now, when Joseph's situation changed and he ended up in prison thanks to Potiphar's wife, he remained faithful. He remained serving God in that platform, prison. And he would be humbled even more, but in there, he learned administrative skills. He did the books. He gained favor by the prison keeper and the prisoners to include using his authority to serve others. And now he has been brought before the Pharaoh. Now, looking back those 13 years, can you see how each step was necessary? Each step was important in his development. Through all he learned to be able to do what he's doing now, he ran Potiphar's household. Think about it. He also learned to lead Egyptians in a way that would be not offensive to them. He was in that kind of authority. He was a Hebrew, right? He did this in jail as well. And we see clearly every step of the process is necessary. And in a microwave society that we live in, of now, we need to calm down and understand that God did not waste any bit of time with Joseph. As a matter of fact, Joseph would need every bit of that time to develop, to be prepared for the place that God would bring Joseph to and use him for his glory. And now Joseph is ready and will bring glory to God. Now, in our preparation, I just want to reiterate, God does not waste any time with you. As a matter of fact, you need every bit of that time to be developed and prepared. God gives you the call. Let him define the call and the preparation for you. Amen? Verse 50. And to Joseph were born two sons, and I love this, and I'll explain why. Bore two sons before the years of famine came, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh. He gave his sons Hebrews names and named the first Manasseh, meaning to forget. For God has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. And the name of the second he called Ephraim, meaning fruitfulness. For God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. So again, he gives his sons Hebrews names, and we'll talk about the names in a second. But what is important to see is even in the midst of his success, Joseph remained faithful to God. He did not allow the culture or the rise in power or this marriage to influence him or get in the way of his loyalty and faithfulness to God. None of that. I mean, there are so many of us, in this world who would abandon their roots in the face of this success. They'd be tempted to think that they're good and that they can take a vacation from God. Nowhere do we see this with Joseph. He knows the God who placed him in his position is the God who could easily take him out of that position. Remember, he was just in prison just before that. Nowhere does God cave to the success. The world did not define Joseph. God defined him. And that is so important in our development. That is so important in our preparation. And I thought that was interesting that we point that out because he named his sons with Hebrew names. He didn't go the route of Okay, well, my name is now, Sabbath Panea, whatever, and now I need to name my son, the boy who looks out in the river. And, he didn't do that. He names his son. Now, his first son was named Manasseh, meaning to forget. He names him to signify how he can look back and forget the misery of his separation from his family and all he endured up to this point of his son's birth. Seeing all that God is doing and using his life for God's glory, he's not going to ever dig in his past anymore and go back, dwelling on his brothers or what Potiphar's wife did to him or the butler forgetting. He's not going to dwell on those things anymore. He won't think about how wrong he was done, but he chooses to forget. He chose not to dwell on it. That's important. That's important. Now, I'm not saying he truly forgets it all, because nobody forgets really when you're hurt or injustice was done to you, but he is choosing not to dwell there any longer, and we can learn from him. Now, raise your hands. Have you ever been hurt or betrayed to the point that it really weighs on your life pretty heavily? Even after years and years have passed, and when someone does you wrong again, you tend to go back to those same hurts and that same pain. You kind of group everything to that pain, that hurt. And it draws you into a deeper pain. Well, let me ask you this. By looking back at your past, has it ever made you feel any better? No. Going back to the past and dwelling there, reliving it all inside, has it ever brought resolve in your life? It never does. Listen, you're never going to solve anything that way. There has to come a point where you must decide to move forward from your past. Just as Paul says in Philippians chapter 3, verses 13 through 14, he says, "But one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind and reaching forward to those things which are ahead, I press toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus." You can never truly move forward until you're ready to forget the things which are behind you. By giving your past to the Lord, surrender your past to him. It may be also something that you may have done in your own past that God has already forgiven you for, but you haven't forgiven yourself for. Listen, your authority to forgive yourself should never rise above God's standard of grace and his love to forgive you. In other words, your standard of forgiveness does not supersede God's only begotten Son. God has forgiven your sin. He pressed delete. Your folder is empty. So what gives you the authority to search those files out in the empty basket? Because you feel your standard is greater than God's? You need to choose to forgive. Forgive others. Forgive yourself. And then you need to choose to forget and move forward. There has to come a time when all that has been done to you that was wrong, that was hurtful, painful, betraying, deceitful, no matter how you see it, it was wrong. We can define it in many ways. You have to settle and get that in your mind that you cannot fix that. You cannot fix the past. But God, and through God, he will give you the grace to forget when you give it all to him. Leaving it all in the past requires a lot of a trust in the Lord. But at the same time, understand the past. Understand it in who we are today. Our past doesn't define us, but has formed us of who we are today. Romans 8:28. And we know that all things work together for good. Let me say that again. And we know that all things work together for good, even our past. To those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. And what is his purpose for Romans 8:28? Because you can't read Romans 8:28 without Romans 8:29. All things work together for good, right? For whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. Whoa. Isn't that beautiful? It's glorious. It's glorious. For whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. We may have done, some bad things in our life. We may have been done wrong by other people. We may have been hurt. We maybe hurt others. We may have been messed over, betrayed. But God uses all these things so we may grow and be conformed and fashioned into the image of Jesus Christ, his Son. All things work for good. And this is what Paul means when he says, but one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind and reaching forward to those things which are ahead. He knew that that was something he needed to do. So don't let your past rip you off of the things which are ahead, but give your past to the Lord and trust him with it and press forward. And Joseph then calls his second son, this is what's beautiful, Ephraim, meaning fruitful. So in addition of Joseph forgetting his painful past, he is communicating through his son Ephraim that now he will set his sights on the blessings of the Lord and on his glory for all he has in God. Now, many of us all come from different backgrounds. And at our younger ages are when things significantly impact who we are today. That's when we get hit through our young ages, right? Many of us have gone through tough pasts, hard upbringings, whether rich or poor, whatever the case may be. But those of us who have come to the knowledge of Jesus, despite your background and who you are, we can all agree that when we walk in the Lord in obedience, it is a blessed life. And that the Lord does not leave us who we were, but rather we grow in him to the very person he has called us to be, which is the image of his Son. We are children of God. That's glorious. It is so glorious. And just through this great work of the Lord in our lives, we can see that there are many blessings that we have been given in Christ Jesus that we can easily think of in our life today. It's not hard to think of all the blessings. In other words, we could easily fall in to our thinking about our past when things go wrong and just dwell there, or we can choose to forget our past and think of all the blessings that we have in the Lord. And we can just sit in awe. I guarantee we can sit in awe with a heart of thanksgiving. It's just amazing. So Joseph chooses to forget his past and dwell on the blessing of today. And it's beautiful how, I think this is the most beautiful we've seen in Scripture, how he names his boys. Some of them you're like, wow. The child who makes me pull my hair. Like, what is that Hebrew name? Verse 53, then the 7 years of plenty, which were in the land of Egypt, ended, and the 7 years of famine began to come. As Joseph had said, the famine was in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. So the famine was in all the lands, not just in Egypt, but everywhere outside of Egypt. And there was no food except there was bread in Egypt. So when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to the Pharaoh for bread. Then Pharaoh said to the Egyptians, go to Joseph, and whatever he says to you, you do. So people were already begging for food, and as we see it, the first result of that were the Egyptians. And so Pharaoh directs them to Joseph. The famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians. That's where we start. And the famine became severe in the land of Egypt. So all countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain because the famine was severe in all lands. So this is amazing. And what we will see next week is how God is using this famine to draw Israel to come towards Egypt. Israel meaning Jacob and the family. Right? The whole world is being impacted by this famine, and the sons of Israel will make their way to Egypt for grain. But Joseph, we will also see, will deal with his brothers, but in a godly way. He had already dealt with the past. God and him already reconciled that. And God will give him the grace to deal with what is coming, what's up ahead. And it's so amazing. And we will continue to chapter 42 next week, Lord willing. Let us pray.